Crypto Q's, good to see how you doing. First one in today. Good to see Artistic, good to see as well how you're doing. Things are going good. How's things with you, Artistic? Hi, Miles. Johnny, good to see as well how you're doing. T, good to see as well how you're doing, brother. Miles, if Ripple Tech can be used without XRP, where is the XRP value? So Ripple Tech only has one advantage. The XRP ledger brings more advantage towards the table. Ripple essentially payments can only do finance, whereas the XRP ledger can also do tokenization and finance. Also, Ripple has mentioned that on their own blog post, essentially on Ripple's own website, it does mention that Ripple Payments utilizes the XRP ledger and XRP itself. So there's many use cases for XRP. Morning, Miles of CMF. Shelly, good to see you all morning. How you doing? Good evening, all. JP, good to see you all. How you doing? But that is also something that I shared and discussed with everyone about a year ago when that topic came up of, why would Ripple use XRP? There's no point. They can use Ripple payments. And I brought up a lot of valid points, which I could still bring up even to this day. How the XRP ledger essentially brings so much more utilization towards the table than Ripple payments can. Ripple payments was just to get the banks on board and entering, into essentially the digital payments essentially sector. The XRP ledger was the final goal, hence why it took Ripple a little bit of a while, but they finally came out and said that XRP plays the heart of essentially what Ripple is. JP, good to see you, brother. How you doing? Let's go, Miles. What's up? How have you been? Curtis, I'm doing great. Good to see you, brother. How you doing? Hope you had a great weekend, mate, and look forward to the live. Let's go, Addy. How you doing? Can governments create their own ODL or bypass XRP? Governments can obviously create their own crypto projects if they wanted to. It's not recommended because they'll probably just mess it up or essentially get compromised. And also because the research and the study and the money and the time has already been spent on creating, for example, the XRP ledger, or XLM's essential ledger, or Referral's ledger, or Solano's ledger, or AVAX's ledger. There's no point for them to go out there and restart again when there's so much good technology out there that they could essentially utilize for different aspects, essentially for different sectors. So it's about money, time, and cost, and it doesn't make sense for them logically to go out and create their own. They can if they wanted to a long time ago, but now it's just too late. Now it's just more like adopt or get left behind, essentially, from other countries around the world who have adapted, in terms of blockchain technology quite a lot. Hope you had a great weekend, mate. Look forward to the live. Let's go, Addy. Good evening, Miles. How are you doing? I'm doing great, Callie. Good to see you. How you doing? I need $100, Miles. T, why do you need $100? I need XRP 100. Or you need XRP at $100. It's not right. It's not, in my opinion, it's not a far-fetched target in any sort of a way, but it also does have to, Clarity Act, essentially go into utility. When can we see a Clarity Act? Well, hopefully mid-March essentially is going to be one of the discussions for it. Now, putting that all to one side, let's do the intro disclaimer, what we're going to talk about on tonight's live show. So here it is. Welcome to the CMF Live. If you're watching this for the first time ever, the CMF stands for Crypto Mouse Family. My name is Miles. You can tune into this live Monday, Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards for the most recent news regarding cryptocurrency, CBDCs, AI, politics, and regulations. Pretty much all the information you should know about regarding the world completely transforming into a digital space. The disclaimer of this live show, as always, is not financial advice, not political advice, and whatever I say is only for entertainment purposes. And also, we do Q&As in this live as well, which means if you do have any questions, go for inside the comment section. More than happy to help you out. This is episode 454 of the CMF Live Show. If you liked and retweeted this live show, thank you so much, CMF members. If you haven't, I can tell who hasn't liked and who hasn't retweeted the live shows, just saying. If you liked essentially on YouTube as well, thank you so much. Now, let me give you a breakdown of what we're going to talk about on tonight's live. We're going to talk about essentially the crypto market space and this war that's still going on in the Middle East, with essentially Bitcoin crypto prices and America, essentially Israel and Iran, essentially is the first thing we're going to cover on tonight's live show, because the crypto market slowly bounced back. And this is to do with the war in the Middle East. Now, we're also going to talk about essentially some perspective news on tonight's live show as well from Tom Lee. And his newest perspective is that we're pretty much coming out of that winter crypto stage, and we're going to go into a much more better space instead of crypto sector. And it is mostly based on the Clarity Act. We're also going to talk about Michael Saylor on tonight's live show as well. Once again, Michael Saylor has put his money where his mouth is and purchased a lot more Bitcoin. We'll discuss that on tonight's live. We're also going to talk about one of the biggest, essentially, global insurance brokers is thinking about essentially entering the crypto space. It is huge news in that sense. We're also going to talk about tonight's live regarding the US essentially Treasury signals shift on crypto mixers. We're going to go through news on tonight's live regarding the NASDAQ essentially going full tokenization is what they're thinking about doing. A 24/7 essentially market space for the NASDAQ, which is absolutely massive. We're going to talk about also Nigel Farage on this live show as well, somebody that we ever talk about on this live show, to be fairly honest. We don't really discuss essentially British politicians on this live show unless it's Keir Starmer because he's an absolute tool and he has essentially let the British public down quite a lot. Other than that, we don't really discuss British politics. We do discuss a lot of American essentially politics because America is the biggest market space in the world. Whatever they do impacts the rest of the world, essentially good or bad. In most cases, being on the Trump, it's all been good so far in my eyes. In my eyes, there's been one or two, but majority are all good. Now, Clarity Act is also what we're going to talk about tonight's live show. The biggest topic essentially for the crypto space is the Clarity Act. We're going to talk about essentially tokenized asset market spaces in terms of how far they've come so far. We're also going to go through news on tonight's live show regarding essentially Canton as well. We're also going to go through news on tonight's live show regarding essentially the privacy essentially sector as well. We're going to go through some cybersecurity news regarding the United States. We're going to go through some Latin American news in terms of cryptocurrencies as well. We're also going to go through news on tonight's live show regarding Coinbase and essentially tax reporting when it comes to crypto spaces. And also Ripple news to go through on tonight's live show, as we always do. Now, the first news essentially being on the war, and it's the reason why the crypto market space ever so slightly went up, essentially, you could say. So here it is. Here's the first news. Bitcoin and stocks rally as Trump essentially teases a potential Iran resolution. Now, if you haven't seen the news recently, the war is still obviously continuing in essentially the Middle East with Iran, US, and Israel. According to Trump's essentially recent speech today, that war is going to continue, and Trump essentially and the United States and Israel are winning. There are people on TikTok who are saying that the US is losing. They're definitely living in delusional land because the reality of it is Iran's government has absolutely been essentially obliterated. This was not a war or a competition. This was a demolition. And the Iranian government absolutely got wasted in every sort of angle possible. So if you haven't seen the news, that's what's essentially been going on. And it's still continuing and it's not going to end. And Trump did say that essentially he is going to be the one in charge of deciding who's going to be the next leader of Iran. Some people essentially are aggravated online that, why does Trump get to vote who's the next essential leader of Iran? Well, because the Iranian government has done such a terrible job since 1979. Why not give an outside perspective is what I would say. Not why not, and in my opinion, they should. And I think that what Trump is doing is great, and he should wipe out the rest of them too, especially Ali Khamenei's son, who has just been essentially elected as the new leader of Iran. I think he also deserves to meet his father very soon. Now, global markets experienced a sharp relief rally, essentially as President Trump signaled that the conflict with Iran could essentially be over very soon because America is absolutely winning, which helped the essential crypto market space rise in price just ever so slightly. This optimistic, essentially theoretic rhetoric essentially triggered a synchronized risk-on move across essentially both traditional equities and digital asset sectors, erased immediate essentially concerns regarding energy supply shocks and global instability by potentially flipping the switch back towards diplomacy. The administration has provided a temporary essential revive essentially for the financial plumbing of the global economy, allowing Bitcoin essentially to bounce back alongside major indices. However, a contrasting or essentially analytic narrative suggests that Bitcoin could emerge as the ultimate essentially big winner if the conflicts defies these optimistic projections and drags on for several essentially months. Prominents essentially of this view argue that the protracted essentially war would likely lead to a sustained inflation and further erosion of trust in legacy essentially banking blockades, driving both retail and institutional capital towards decentralized hedges. Now they're actually coming out, analytics are now coming out saying the longer this war carries on, the more money that's going to be transferred over into crypto. It's something that I said before the war even started. I said this war is very different. Every war, the crypto market space gets absolutely hammered and it essentially goes sliding downwards. And in this war, it did go a little bit down, but it's been bouncing here and there because it's very different, essentially, as how it's being played out. Also, the borderless reserve essentially becomes an indemnitable essentially tool for seeking to bypass the volatility of destabilized fiat-based systems. They're seeing crypto as the better outcome during this war as well. Also, the Iranian government is money laundering right now through crypto too. The tension essentially between the two outcomes underscores the current essentially state of the 2026 market space, where geopolitical headlines dictate the flow of institutional liquidity. Immediate market relief. Trump's comments essentially have led to a decrease in the war premium on oil, which essentially in turn bolstered investor confidence, essentially in the United States Clarity Act and other domestic, essentially pro-growth policies. Analysts also essentially maintain that any further essentially escalations would test the Genius Act's frameworks, as a prolonged conflict would likely essentially highlight the superior essentially resilience of decentralized system layers over traditional cross-border payment rails. Also, whether the resolution is swift or essentially slow, the increased essentially focus on sovereign risk is also pushing more central banks to consider the flipping of the switches for digital reserve allocations, similar to recent moves we've seen essentially in Kazakhstan was one of the countries that I shared. Also, tonight we're going to talk about Latin America. Latin America is doing quite a lot inside the crypto space, but we'll come to that a little bit later on. But so far, essentially, this war, analysts are now coming out saying this war is very different and we should expect in the crypto market space to actually rise in price during this war rather than it go slumping downwards. I mean, that should have been a given before the war even started, but a lot of people did think essentially, this war is going to be like every other war. Crypto goes shooting down. And I said, people are not considering the money laundering aspect of this war either. Now, putting that to one side, the crypto market space doing a little bit good today. To a essentially perspective on tonight's live show. Mini crypto essentially winter nearly over, says Tom Lee, as Bitmain essentially ramps up their Ether acquisition. So, Foxtrot's Tom Lee has came once again on the news and has signaled that the recent mini crypto winter is likely approaching its conclusion. Interesting, essentially, outlook, as the analysts are also saying this war is going to be good for the crypto space, citing a shift in market structure and stabilizing essentially macroeconomic conditions. Lee suggests that the recent divulging of events has flushed out speculative forth, paving the way for more sustainable recovery as institutional on ramps begin to hump essentially once again. This optimistic outlook essentially also conceives with a broader sense that the utility era remains intact as the underlying financial plumbing of the digital economy continues to mature despite the recent localized drawdowns and essentially in recent price actions. The narrative of the market turnaround is being blustered by aggressive moves from major industry players. I also explained a few days ago, essentially on this live show, that institutions, after Trump's tweet, essentially that no matter what, the Clarity Act will be passed and the banks are no longer allowed to keep the crypto space at hostage, it actually blustered the crypto market space since that day even more because institutions know now for a fact, whether they like it or not, or whether the banks like it or not, this is going to pass. So that's why they're buying on the side right now, while some people might still be panicking and, selling because of a war. So, Bitmain has significantly accelerated its pace of essentially buying Ethereum, signaling a higher level of essential of conviction, long-term value of the network's programmability utility. Institutional signals are happening right now. Analysts view Bitmain's ramp-ups as a flipping of the switches for corporate treasuries who are increasingly looking essentially past the short-term volatility to secure positions in the foundational blockchain protocols. The market is beginning to price in long-term benefits of the US Clarity Act. In other words, the market is now saying the US Clarity Act is going to pass no matter what. So now essentially the movements are happening even more, which is expected to provide a legal moat necessary for the larger capital essentially allocators to re-enter the space with confidence. As the industry moves out of this brief cooling period, the focus is shifting towards the fundamental roles of Ethereum as the primary essentially settlement layer for tokenized real-world assets. The convergence essentially of Tom Lee's bullish technical analysis and essentially Bitmain's significant capital deployments suggest that the old guard skepticism is once again being replaced by the essentially drive for digital asset first financial infrastructure. While geopolitical headlines continue to provide an occasional essentially friction, the 2026 outlook for the digital economy appears increasingly robust as major entities prepare essentially for the next phase of global expansions. Honestly, wiping out the Iranian government has many benefits for the world. One, Middle East will be safe. Two, the crypto space is actually benefiting from the essentially Iranian regime being completely wiped out. Now, there's so many benefits to wiping out the essentially Islamic Republic of Iran from the surface of the earth. All of them are an absolute waste of oxygen. Now, Michael Saylor is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. Michael Saylor's strategy has led to a $1.3 billion essentially Bitcoin purchase last week. Once again, Michael Saylor, no matter how many people think he's a fool for putting all of his money in the same basket, which is Bitcoin, while there are, incredible assets out there inside the crypto space that have so much potential, so much utility, they might not have the essentially attractive 21 million supply token, but they do have a very attractive, essentially, utility use cases for the world. It could be finance, it could be Web3, it could be AI, it could be tokenization. There's so much great projects out there. I would say he should diversify. Everyone thinks he should diversify, but MicroStrategy has essentially significantly bolstered its corporate treasuries with a massive $1.3 billion Bitcoin acquisition over the past week, further cementing its position as the world's largest corporate holder of assets. Under essentially the leadership of Michael Saylor, the firm has utilized proceeds from convertible debt offering to execute the purchase during a period essentially of relative market consolidation. This move also underscores an unwavering commitment to utility era finance, where Bitcoin serves as the primary capital preservation such a tool within the company's modern financial plumbing. The sheer scale of this acquisition highlights the continued institutional flipping of the switches, regardless essentially of digital reserve assets. Since Brad Girlinghouse, essentially from Ripple, mentioned the words "there's flipping of the switches" or "there's so many switches to flip," every analytic, every CEO, CTO from any project out there is now using the words, or even banks and institutions are now using the words of flipping of the switches due to Brad mentioning essentially this sentence first. Now, by leveraging essentially low interest debt to acquire a scarce digital commodity, MicroStrategy continues to execute a blueprint essentially that many analysts believe will be adapted essentially by other firms under the US Clarity Act and framework. The $1.3 billion purchase effectively removed a significant amount of supply from the market space, signaling a strong conviction despite the recent geopolitical volatilities and risk of settlements seen in other sectors. Saylor's persistent and increasingly viewed as a catalyst for the Clarity Act momentum as more lawmakers, essentially lawmakers and corporate essentially boards explore the role of decentralized assets in protecting against essentially traditional currency debasements. As the 2026 digital economy continues to mature, MicroStrategy's aggressive accumulation and essentially its strategy serves as a primary on-ramp for institutional credibility. While some critics essentially point to the risk of such high essentially connection between Bitcoin and MicroStrategy, the firm's ability to repeatedly access capital markets for Bitcoin purchases suggests a deep level of investor support for strategy. In other words, strategies investors are not coming out shouting and essentially, going against whatever move MicroStrategy is trying to pull inside Bitcoin essentially sector. They're not against him. They were for a small period of time. There was a few investors that were suing him, but they went away. For the broader market, this move essentially provides a significant liquidity flow, reinforcing the idea that transition away from legacy banking blockades is being led essentially by bold, high conviction corporate pioneers. As much as he's not diversifying his portfolio, and we all wish he did for at least for the market space in general, but you got to give credit where credit is due. He does put his money where his mouth is. He says Bitcoin this, Bitcoin that, Bitcoin maxi, Bitcoin's the future, Bitcoin's digital gold, and he does buy. He's not just using words. But that's what I mean. You got to give credit where credit is due. Now, moving on, essentially from that to global insurance broker Aon is testing stablecoin payments with essentially Coinbase and Paxos. It's incredible. So, a global insurance giant, essentially Aon, has launched a pilot program to test stablecoin payments for premiums and claims and settlements, essentially partnering with industry leaders, essentially Coinbase and Paxos. This initiative essentially marks a significant step in modernizing the insurance industry's financial plumbing, as the firm essentially seeks to leverage the speed and transparency of blockchain technology to replace traditional slow-moving payment rails. By utilizing fiat-backed digital assets, assets, Aeon essentially aims to eliminate the friction with multi-day essentially delays and typically associated with cross-border insurance transactions, effectively flipping the switches. On more efficient settlement models, the pilot program focuses on the practical application of stablecoins within a highly regulated corporate environment. This is quite massive that a firm like this is thinking about, coming into the crypto space, going, full tokenization mode. By using stablecoins issued by Paxos and infrastructure provided by Coinbase, Aeon can facilitate 24/7 payments, ensuring that claims can be paid out to clients almost immediately after approval. Reduce intermediary cost. The move into the utility era of finance allows the broker to bypass several layers of legacy banking blockades, significantly lowering essentially transaction fees associated with essentially international currency conversions and wire transfers. When firms like this join the crypto space, it's a signal to the rest of the institutions out there that Clarity Act is going to happen whether you like it or not. And when you see firms like this take steps inside the crypto space, it shows us a level of confidence. It's going to happen. That's why we are choosing to adapt while you can sit on the sidelines. When firms like this do moves like this, it makes other firms think twice and maybe they should enter the crypto space as well. The project is designed to align with the emerging standards of the US Clarity Act, providing a transparent and auditable, essentially, trail for digital asset movements to satisfy essentially global insurance regulators. Industry analysts suggest that Aeon's entry into the stablecoin space could serve as a catalyst for the broader professional services and sectors to essentially adopt digital asset solutions. As the Genius Act essentially continues to gain momentum, the successful integration of tokenized cash into the issuance value chain demonstrates that technology essentially is ready for large-scale enterprise use. For global corporations, the ability to manage risk and move capital, the precision essentially of digital native platforms is becoming essentially a very competitive necessity in the 2026 global economy. It's definitely going to get a lot more firms involved inside the crypto space when you have a massive broker essentially coming inside this blockchain space. Now, putting that all to one side, the next news we're going to talk about tonight's live show is US Treasury signals shift. Before we talk about that, let's go to the comment section first. As I previously, this is live, which means if you have any questions, go for inside the comment section. So let's see where we're at inside the comment section. We were here, I think. Sorry, I'm late to this. No problem. Okay, no, we were here. When can you get? Oh no, Miles. Miles. What is your top 5 cryptos? XRP, XLM, XDC, HBAR, I would say now, yeah, because they do play quite a bit of a role. Um, Fifth one, it could be between essentially AVAX, it could be between Canton, it could be between Ondo, it could also be between essentially, I'll see those ones. If I did miss any good ones, let me know. Cardano's obviously out there as well, but I don't know. Cardano's founder, sometimes he's playing ball, sometimes he isn't. I don't know what's happening with the guy. Yeah, but top 3 is always going to be for me XRP, XLM, XTC. And then essentially whatever's going to be next, it will be HBAR, it could be essentially AVAX, it could be Ondo, it could be Adder, it could be essentially Sol. It could be essentially, yeah, I would say those ones. Even BNB will play a nice role inside the Asian market space. I would have to say Near will play a nice role as well. Hot is, long, high risk, high reward type of scenario. We have Beam, it's all right inside the gaming sector. We have essentially ACH as well. They're thinking about going on their own chain, which is a good play for them. There's quite a lot of projects out there, but the top 3, top 5 is hard to decide, but top 3 is very easy to decide for me. XRP, XLM, XDC. And Ondo's definitely in that list as well. Good play, Ondo. Very good play. It's in my eyes, they're going to become absolutely massive in tokenization in the long run as well. Now, Miles Waters, yeah. Sorry I came late. No problem, Scott. How you doing? Hello, Miles and family. Good to see your commenters. How you doing? Miles, why is the war not finished? Because everyone says Iran is weak. Because everyone says Iran is weak. The Iranian government is extremely weak and extremely delusional. Why is the war not finished? Because it isn't. In reality, it's not finished yet. The aim of the United States, it wasn't just to kill essentially Ali Khamenei, it wasn't just to remove him. The aim of the United States was to remove this entire regime. So until this regime is entirely removed from the surface of the earth, this war isn't going to be coming to an end. Ali Khamenei's son has now just been chosen essentially to become the next leader of Iran. Did people vote for him? Hell no. Nobody likes that man. That man is 10 times worse than his father was. And his father, I could use some words on this live show, but I don't want to essentially because, you're not allowed to say certain words. But he was an absolute Koskish. The best way to put it in Persian, essentially. An absolute Koskish, what he was. I can't say that though. Now, Miles, why is the war not? So that's why the war's not finished because the regime hasn't been removed yet. You can't have a regime in the United States, essentially in Iran, that for 4 hours a day forces people, to chant death to America and death to Israel. So until that regime who chants 4 hours a day death to essentially, America, death to Israel, isn't removed, then the job is not done yet. They need to be removed. They genuinely need to be removed. What is your thoughts on Rupert Law restore Bitcoin? Interesting play on essentially Rupert Law. If anybody doesn't know, essentially he started a new party called Restore Britain. He's going up against Reform, the Green Party, the Conservatives, the Labour Party. Labour has no hope. I mean, this is pretty much the last time we're ever going to see a Labour, essentially Prime Minister, leading Britain ever again. I don't think anyone's going to be dumb enough to vote for Labour twice. However, with essentially Rupert Law and Reform and so on, there's no one good. Rupert Law, I thought he was good. I thought Rupert Law was good, and he stood essentially for British values and so on, and he does up to a certain extent. But then he showed his true colors when he decided to stay out of the Iran war. And I said this. It shows to me that who is spineless and who isn't. Because politicians chat so much, shit, it's unreal. Before they're elected, they will say, I'm all for the country, I will stand for my people, I will do this, I will do that, and so on. And when they become elected, they do absolutely jack squat for 4 years and then they disappear. And then we choose the next moron to lead us for the next 4 years, and he also does nothing as well. So, why I say Rupert Law, in my opinion, is spineless. I said before this war started, if any country, essentially, if any not country, sorry, I said if any president, politician, athlete, celebrity, prime minister, anyone in high level positioning, it could be government or it could be a company, doesn't come out against essentially the Iranian regime, doesn't come out against the Iranian regime, then they are in bed with the Iranian regime. And that is not good for any country. And when Rupert Law came out during America essentially attacking Iran, because they were chanting death to America 4 hours a day, forcing people to chant those words in schools. They are forcing children in schools to essentially chant out death to America for 4 hours a day, essentially, roughly, a day. And also the Iranian regime has taken so many British lives. It could be Iranian British lives, or it could be essentially British soldiers. And the UK did absolutely nothing, essentially, back as a counter towards Iran. Well, as America is now for once standing up, and it's because of a Trump presidency. If we had Kamala essentially leading America, we would never see the US, standing against the Iranian regime. They will be spineless as they were essentially when they had Biden as an essentially president, or they will be more spineless as when they had Obama essentially as their president of the United States, because both of those spineless weasels absolutely did nothing, and they funded the Islamic Republic of Iran billions of tax-paying money instead of helping the people of Iran. How can you give, and I still can't understand till this day, how can a president of a United States of America give billions of dollars to a regime that chants death to America 4 hours a day, forcing children to stay in the schools and even in their own parliaments? How do you give billions of dollars to a government who chants death to you? That just blows my mind of why Obama did that and how much of a spineless twat he is and how much of a spineless twat essentially Biden is as well. And I will say the same thing for Rupert Law. Him coming out and tweeting out essentially, we should stay out of the Iranian war. Fair enough. You want to stay out of the war? Okay. But why not tweet instead? We should be banning the IRGC. We should be banning essentially, Iranian diplomats that work for the Islamic Republic of Iran who chant also death to the United Kingdom or essentially, harming British essentially soldiers. Even in Cyprus, they attacked British military bases, and spineless Keir Starmer did absolutely nothing. And Rupert Law never tweeted anything about that too. So if any, as I said, if any politician, president, prime minister, athlete, celebrity doesn't come out against the Islamic Republic of Iran, they are spineless and they are in bed with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's what I would say about Rupert Law. I thought he was the best option. I thought he was the Trump 2.0. I genuinely thought Rupert Law was Trump 2.0 for the British public. It turns out he's a spineless twat as well. Because I get you don't want to be in a war, but you could have said, how about we ban the IRGC? But you didn't say that. And that just shows me you are also in bed with them. So that's what I would say to that. Now, um, Professor Jing says USA will lose war, so we'll see when the new Ayatollah will be toppled. Good one. There is a Chinese professor who is slowly becoming quite famous on social media and is creating these posts and putting, I'm so happy somebody brought this up because I really wanted to, explain this to people online because there's a Chinese professor that's going around right now and saying America is going to lose because of this historic against Iran. America is going to lose, essentially against Iran because of these historical events and because America is, dropping $1 million essentially missiles on Iran, while Iran is dropping $30,000 drones on the US, and therefore it's not a sustainable war for America to continue if they're going to drop $1 million missiles, and that's why America is going to, run out of money, and they're not going to be able to produce any more missiles to hit Iran while Iran's throwing $30,000 essentially missiles. Look, here is what that moronic professor didn't mention and why he didn't want to mention it, because his entire argument, Professor Zheng's entire argument, will go to absolute shit. You know why? Because the guy didn't mention that America is also now reproducing the same $30,000 essentially drones that Iran was sending to America, to American essentially vessels and ships and so on. Those same drones, America replicated them. So America is no longer just dropping $1 million missiles essentially on Iran. They're also dropping $30,000 essentially drones. Do you think America was born yesterday? They're just going to continue dropping $1 billion missiles when Iran is dropping $30,000 drones? No, America started replicating Iran's $30,000 drones and sending it back to them. But the professor didn't mention that because his entire argument will go to shit on the whole topic of America is spending too much money while as Iran isn't. Well, America is doing the exact same thing. They're sending the same crappy weapons the Iranian government was using back to them. Also, let's not forget, essentially, America 6 months prior, essentially, Trump, knowing this war was going to happen, 6 months prior, he filled in essentially an application, you could pretty much say, to print more and to get more weaponry. Now, what type of weaponry did Trump essentially say he wants to get 6 months prior before this war started? Essentially, 3 months prior to 6 months prior before this war started. He said he wants essentially cheap to medium size, essentially, weaponry to go up against Iran. And again, the Professor Jing didn't mention this in any sort of a way because his argument will completely go to zero. The guy is an absolute tool, is what I would say to you, essentially, whatever he has to say. Do you know what he does? He mentions a few essentially historical events that have happened and it's going to happen because of this, this, and that. And he mentions things that have happened. So they're accurate historical events. But then he leaves out certain parts so his argument seems stiffened. In reality, his argument is weak, absolutely weak. So thank you for mentioning that, Chinese professor essentially. And let's not forget he's Chinese. Not saying essentially every Chinese person is a part of the Chinese government or the CCIP, but this one seems like he's very biased because he leaves out a lot of information that essentially would make his argument look uncredible. His credibility pretty much goes to zero when he mentions his arguments. What's your thought? So good on mentioning him because I don't know if anyone's seen this Chinese professor that's going around. He leaves out certain information so so his arguments look credible, when in reality he's an absolute moron. If you're gonna make a point, make the whole point. Don't make half a point just to try to get your argument out there. What happens if the dollar collapses? Does this mean XRP goes high price? The dollar is never going to collapse. I've said this 4 years ago. I'll say it again. The US dollars is never going to collapse. Everybody inside the crypto, I said this 4 years ago, and I'll still stick by it, and I'll stick by it forever. The dollar is just going to go digital. In the fiat world, the US dollars is number one. In a digital world, crypto, stable coins, the US dollars is number one. And it's going to continue like that. Why is it going to continue like that? The dollar is never going to go to zero because the stable coins are backed by fiat, they're backed by US bonds and US treasuries. And as long as they're going to print more USDT, more PYUSD, more RLUSD, more USDC, and so on, they're going to be backed by fiat US dollars as well. So therefore, the dollar is never going to go to zero. It was never going to go to zero in the first place. And I said this 4 years ago, and I still stand by it. While everybody else was chanting the US dollar is going to go to zero. Look, we know it's useless. We know it's overprinted, but we're still going to use it. And there's no benefit of it going to zero. If the US dollars goes to zero, that means the US economy will crash. And that means the world's economy will crash. Do you know the amount of countries that are holding US treasuries, US bonds, US dollars? If that happens, the whole world goes to absolute, you know. So that argument was always moronic to start off with. Is the problem? Yes. Well, in the UK. Hi Miles, a CMF. Stormy, good to see you. How you doing? Hi Miles, a CMF family. Let's go. Essentially, how are you doing, Carl? Good to see you guys. Let's go for Facts News. Let's go, Carl. How you doing? Link? Question mark. Oh, Chainlink. Yes, Chainlink is also a good project as well. Sorry about that. Forgot. Thank you so much, Shelley, for that. I did say if I did forget to mention, if I forgot to mention any projects, there's probably good projects out there as well. I just forgot to mention them. Link as well. Thank you so much for that, Shelley. Miles, my brother registered to the exchange platform and made his first deposit. Keep you updated. Thank you so much, Carl. I thought same Rupert Law talking down good stuff, but something about him seems spineless and they do all nothing. Yeah. I genuinely thought Rupert Law was going to be like the next Trump for the British people. And then he comes out with that spineless, essentially spineless tweet, how we should stay out of the Iran war. I get that. You don't want to be in a war, but it's a country that's threatened British soldiers. And your tweet was, I don't want to get into a war. How much of a spineless twat do you have to be to say that? When British soldiers have been, essentially, British bases have been hit, essentially, in Cyprus. And your response is still, I don't want to get into a war. You can't have a leader of a country who doesn't care about the military of that country, because that just shows how spineless they are. Whereas Trump, hate him, love him, he is patriotic. He loves America, he loves the American people, and he loves the American military. Whoever may be women or men, he loves all of them. He's very patriotic. That's one thing nobody could take away from Trump. He's extremely patriotic when it comes to his country, when it comes to the United States of America. Hate him or love him, that's one thing nobody could take away from him. Now, even though I was a CMF, Joe, good to see you. How you doing? I thought Iran essentially has no money. How they essentially pay? They pay rupee law. Iran has a lot of money, a huge amount of money. For 47 years, they haven't spent a single penny in Iran's economy. All they did was essentially money launder and do a lot of bad things, which I can't discuss on this live show. But every Iranian is aware, essentially, of what the Iranian regime has done, which is very evil things around this world. Why do people insist on using the word supreme leader when they talk about the scumbag, essentially Ayatollah? I agree. There is nothing supreme about him. In fact, they are inferior. I agree, 100%. People shouldn't be using that word at all. In my opinion, he was a rat. That's what I would use. In Persian, essentially, we call him Mush Ali. Mush Ali, essentially, in other words, means mice or mouse, essentially, Ali, Ayatollah, in other words. We don't call him essentially supreme leader Iranian. Iranians call him Rat Ali or Mice Ali because he always hides in caves and never pops his head out unless, he got, absolutely obliterated by 40 missiles. Now, US Treasury signals essentially shift on crypto mixers. Now, if you are not familiar with crypto mixers, it is something that we discussed a while back ago. Crypto mixers essentially are used to move crypto around so it becomes private and that nobody can know where it essentially originally came from. Some people use it because it's for privacy reasons, and some people use it to launder money. So it's a difficult line on where we're going to stand on that, essentially. Not us, but where governments stand on that. So the newest update on crypto mixes, in other words, people trying to be private inside the crypto space. US Treasury signals a shift on crypto mixers, acknowledging essentially legitimate privacy use cases. The US Department of Treasury has signaled a significant shift in its regulatory stance towards cryptocurrency mixers, acknowledging for the first time that these tools have legitimate uses for consumer privacy. Essentially, this pivot suggests a move away from the blanket ban and approach essentially of previous years, as officials recognize in the essentially utility era. Businesses and individuals essentially may require autonomy for sensitive transactions by essentially distinguishing between illicit money laundering and lawful, essentially privacy seeking behaviors. The Treasury is effectively beginning to update the financial plumbing of the digital economy to better essentially balance national security with individual rights. The new guidance introduces essentially a more nuanced framework for how essentially these privacy enhancing technologies will be treated under federal law. The Treasury essentially now differentiates between privacy preserving essential protocols used for standard commercial protection and the other side of the spectrum, which is used for essentially criminals and money laundering. So, risk based compliance is a very difficult way to essentially get a handle on this market space for governments. So, under the evolving US Clarity Act landscape, developers of privacy tools may be encouraged to implement a voluntarily view keys or selective disclosure features that allow for audits without compromising total user data. So, in other words, if you are somebody that uses a crypto mixer or uses privacy tokens, a crypto mixer is like a blender. The simplest metaphor I could give, essentially, or analogy I could give, is like think of it as like a blender, like you would make a milkshake inside of, or so on, or a smoothie. And crypto goes inside this blender. Your crypto will go inside this blender. It will blend and come out the other side, essentially, and they won't be able to tell where it essentially originated from. And it is used quite a lot for criminal activities, or people who just want to stay private inside the crypto sector, or tax evasion in some cases. But this shift is expected to flip the switch for institutional players who have been hesitant to use public blockchains for corporate treasuries and managements due to transparent natures of on-chain ledgers. So why is the government now saying, mixers is okay? Because institutions can use it to stay private, essentially, in terms of payments. However, if you're thinking, well, this is a way for the institutions to wash billions of dollars without people knowing it, no, they're actually going to put a backdoor. If anybody uses crypto mixers or privacy tokens, they're going to put some sort of a backdoor. That's going to be inside the Clarity Act, the simplest way to put it. They're going to have some sort of backdoor so that if the government wants to do audits, they can check to see if your money's not, your crypto is not being used for illicit activities. They don't know who you are, but they can check where that transaction is going towards. So you stay private, but your transactions don't. Market participants are hailing this development essentially as a major win for the Genius Act momentum, which seeks to establish the US as the leader essentially in both financial innovation and personal liberty. Analysts suggest that they might be essentially providing essentially a path for regulated privacy. The government is making it easier for traditional banking institutions to integrate with decentralized networks without fear of immediate regulatory appraisals, while the Treasury remains essentially committed to aggressive enforcements against these state-sponsored actors. This move signals the 2026 regulatory environment is now becoming sophisticated enough to accommodate the complex, essentially, realities of digital native global economies. It is a big win, honestly, for the privacy sector as well. Institutions, had this side to them where they want to walk in gray areas because it essentially leads to lawsuits. So, what's their next big move? This could actually help them to stay private. Now, moving on from privacy institutions and crypto mixers to the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ is going to go full 24/7 tokenization market space by the looks of it. NASDAQ and Kraken team up to launch tokenized stock trading. This is massive. In a landmark partnership that bridges the gap between traditional equities and the digital asset ecosystem, NASDAQ and Kraken have announced a joint venture to enable the trading of tokenized stocks. This collaboration will allow users to trade fractionalized versions of blue chip shares a 24/7 essentially basis utilizing high-speed settlement capabilities of blockchain technology by integrating essentially the financial plumbing of legacy essentially exchange and powerhouses with a leading digital asset platform. The move signals a major shift in the utility era, where the barriers between conventional essentially brokerage accounts and crypto wallets are effectively being dismantled. The partnership represents a significant flipping of the switches for market accessibility and infrastructure efficiency, 24/7 market access. By tokenizing traditional equities, the venture removes the constraints of standard market hours, allowing global investors to react to news and manage portfolios in a continuous digital native environment. The initiative lowers the entry barrier for retail investors by allowing the purchase of essentially micro shares, a move that aligns with the goals often essentially cited by the US Clarity Act in discussions. Leveraging Kraken's robust trading engine and Nasdaq regulatory expertise, the platform aims to replace the multi-day essentially clearing cycles of the old guard with atomic on-chain settlements. Industry analysts suggest that this collaboration could provide the necessary blueprint for the Genius Act to expand its scope into the broader tokenization of real-world assets. As institutional desks increasingly look for more efficient ways to manage their collateral and liquidity, the ability to trade stocks with the same ease as Bitcoin is expected to drive massive volume into the emerging digital economy. This development further essentially solidifies the transition away from legacy banking blockades and positioning the United States at the forefront of the 2026 global financial transformation. So it is absolutely essentially massive news. Basically, essentially one of the biggest marketplaces in the world entering essentially the digital atmosphere. It's incredible to hear. One today hearing essentially by the broker, the massive broker essentially that's entered the crypto space. Two, Nasdaq thinking about going 24/7 with Kraken. Massive news. Now, putting that to one side, Nigel Farage is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. Now, this is no sort of a way an advocate for essentially Nigel Farage or Reform Party. I'm not a fan of any of these parties. We need a new party, and it's none of these ones. I'll be honest. In my opinion, they have their goods and they have their bads, and some of them just have bads. But now, Nigel Farage is doing something interesting. At least, I'll be very honest, at least Nigel Farage is standing with the Iranian people. He's standing against the IRGC. And he's said multiple times that, the UK should be taking action against the Iranian regime who attacked the British bases. At least Nigel Farage is not spineless as essentially Rupert Law is. But, you know, Nigel Farage has made a significant move in digital asset sector by acquiring a 6% stake in Stake BTC. Nigel Farage looks like he's doing what Trump was doing inside the United States early days on. His sons, Trump's family entering the blockchain space, becoming CEOs of Bitcoin companies and so on. We're seeing that happening with Nigel Farage right now. Trump was the first president or the first leader of any country that took cryptocurrencies very seriously. You could argue the point of the UAE being more serious or Singapore was earlier on inside the crypto space, yes, but Trump made his entire campaign also about the crypto sector. Since that, we haven't seen anybody else except South Korea. Essentially, one party tried to make it their entire campaign as well. Also, Thailand after Trump as well tried to make it their entire campaign as well, and so on. But putting that to one side, a UK-based firm dedicated to helping corporations integrate Bitcoin into their balance sheets. This investment highlights the growing essentially political and institutional momentum behind the utility era. As a prominent figures inside the UK look to challenge the traditional financial plumbing of the City of London by backing a firm that facilitates corporate digital reserves, Farage is signaling essentially a shift towards decentralized alternatives to the legacy banking blockade, positioning himself as the forefront of the British sound money movement. The acquisition underscores a broader trend of high-profile on-ramps for digital assets and advocacies within the United Kingdom. Corporate essentially adoption focus. The Stack BTC specializes essentially providing the infrastructure and regulatory essentially guidance necessary for UK businesses to flip the switch by heavy stalling essentially heavy treasuries to Bitcoin allocated portfolios. Farage's involvement is expected to bring increased visibility to the debate over digital assets and regulations in Westminster, potentially essentially mirroring the momentum seen with the US Clarity Act across the Atlantic. So if honestly Nigel Farage is going to be playing some sort of a crypto role inside United Kingdom, I would actually vote for him. if he is going to play some sort of crypto role, if he is actually going to bring some sort of crypto regulations, just based on, he might do something positive for the crypto space, the same way Trump did for the American space. It's an interesting one. The move aligns with Farage's long-standing critique of centralized financial institutions by promoting essentially Bitcoin as a transparent and borderless tool for protecting corporate wealth in 2026 and global economy. Market observers suggest that essentially this stake could serve as a catalyst for other UK investors to reconsider the role of digital assets in a post-Brexit financial landscape. As the Genius Act dominates headlines in the United States, Farage's entry into the space suggests that the race to become a global hub is intensifying. While the UK's regulatory environment has faced criticism for being slower than its peers, the backing of such a high profile figure may accelerate the push for a more pro innovation framework that also integrates essentially other assets like the XRP ledger and high utility protocols into the nation's core financial systems. He is the only prime minister right now that we have has advocated for cryptocurrencies. The Green Party is lost. The man that's leading the Green Party right now, he is lost. He is no, when he says this person is living in delusional land or la land, the Green Party's leader is the definition of a la land or a delusional land. He doesn't believe in debt. He doesn't believe essentially in the Bank of England debt or the United Kingdom money or so on. He's the definition of delusional. You know, if you thought Biden was bad for the United States, you haven't met the Green Leader Party. They're all about saving the planet and holding hands together and singing Kumbaya together. And the man doesn't believe in the Bank of America. So the man doesn't believe in essentially the Bank of England's debt. The man doesn't know any laws to do with essentially with British law. He doesn't know anything about the economy. He knows jack squat about how money works, and he could potentially be the next leader of the United Kingdom. So if you thought Keir Starmer was bad, move over because we have a new moron in town. Now, Clarity Act is what we're talking about next on tonight's slide. Moving on from the idiots we have, essentially, in terms of politics, to the Clarity Act. The Clarity Act will benefit banks more than crypto. That's one thing I don't think anyone's ever thought about hearing inside the crypto space. The Clarity Act benefits banks more than crypto. Former CFTC chair says, in a recent assessment of the shifting of regulatory landscapes, the former chair of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, suggested that the impending US Clarity Act may provide a greater strict advantage to traditional banking institutions than to crypto native startups. The analysis argues that by establishing a formal federal framework, the legislation effectively hands the key to the utility era to establish players who already possess essentially the compliance, infrastructure, and capital depth to dominate the market space. This perspective indicates that the modernization of the nation's financial plumbing may ultimately essentially serve to enrich the legacy essentially banking system within the digital economy rather than disrupt it. The former regulatory highlighted several ways in which the legislative flipping of the switches favors the incumbents over decentralized essentially challengers. Large-scale banks are already equipped to handle the rigorous reporting and anti-money laundering requirements embedded in the Clarity Act, whereas smaller crypto firms may struggle with increased operational costs. Institutional trust, federal recognition allows the old guard to offer digital asset custody and settlement services with a stamp essentially of government approval, potentially ciphering retail and corporate users away from essentially non-bank platforms. With clear rules, the road tier 1 banks can integrate digital assets directly into their balance sheets, leveraging essentially their massive liquidity to provide more competitive lending essentially and trading essentially products rather than native crypto counterparts. Despite these advantages, essentially for the banking sector, proponents of the Genius Act and broader digital innovation argue that any clear regulations is a net positive for the ecosystem. While the former CFTC chair warns of a potential institutional capture of the technology, many believe that the resulting influx of capital will drive the overall growth of the 2026 digital economy. Whether the future is led by legacy giants or agile startups, the move towards a standardized regulatory environment suggests that the era of unregulated speculative frontier is essentially closing, replaced by a more formal and interconnected global financial system. The former SEC chairman's argument, pretty much, is that people trust banks more, which it's a yes and no type of scenario. Yes, some people trust banks more, and some people don't. The ones that do trust banks, in some cases, it's high profile investors because they see banks as a much more safer option than, crypto exchanges, for example, because they're not insured compared to the banks that essentially are insured. And the banks, essentially, British, essentially government, the max essentially of insurance is around £80,000. So, you could have millions of pounds inside your bank account, and £80,000 is all you're insured up to, essentially. Unless it's a private bank, then it's a different scenario. But his argument essentially is, for American banks or any banks in general, it's better, the Clarity Act, what they have in America and what they can have similar outside of the United States as well, it's going to work out better for the banks because the people will trust the banks. We pass the Clarity Act, the banks go digital, people trust the banks will survive. I'll be honest, essentially, if we pass the Clarity Act and we get licensing, essentially, people have to be pretty damn stupid to, stay with their banks when they could essentially get better ratings, from crypto platforms or from Ripple, being a bank themselves, essentially, slowly. Now, moving on from, but, I love his enthusiasm, and I hope the banks actually listen to the CFTC former chairman. His main point is they're going to adapt essentially to the blockchain sector, and therefore they will do essentially good. And if they don't, then they essentially get left behind, which is a true point. Now, tokenized assets is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. $25 billion. Tokenized assets exceed $25 billion after nearly quadrupling essentially in a year. What does that tell everybody? If tokenized assets have exceeded $25 billion, essentially, after nearly quadrupling in 1 year, that tells us that the institutions are preparing for something major in terms of essentially what's to happen next. Clarity Act. Institutions are preparing, banks are preparing, essentially. Also, family offices are preparing, hedge funds are preparing, and the list goes on. They are all insurance companies. Everyone seems to be preparing. The market for tokenized real world assets has officially surpassed $25 billion milestone, representing nearly a fourfold increase over the past 12 months. This explosive growth signals a major maturation of the utility era, as investors essentially move beyond speculative trading towards the practical application of blockchain for traditional financial instruments. By digitalizing assets such as government bonds and private credit and real estate, the industry is effectively rebuilding the financial plumbing of global markets to allow for more transparent and accessible ownership structures. This rapid expansion reflects a significant shift in how institutional capital is interacting with decentralized infrastructure. Sovereign debt dominance. A primary driver of this growth essentially has been the tokenization of US treasuries, which has essentially allowed global investors to essentially access low risk yields through the same digital rails used for cryptocurrencies. Streamlined capital markets, the flipping of the switches from manual and paper based processes to automated smart contracts has drastically reduced the time and cost associated with issuing and trading private securities. Increased on chain liquidity. As more high quality assets are tokenized, the DeFi ecosystem is gaining a more stable foundation, reducing essentially volatility typically associated with purely digital native tokens. The surge to $25 billion is being viewed as a validation, essentially, of the principles behind the US Clarity Act. I'm telling you right now, as I've said, no matter what, that Clarity Act is going to pass. And with Trump's tweet, it's certified, it's going to pass. No matter who doesn't like it, it's going to pass. And when numbers like this come into the picture, $25 billion, exceeding $25 billion in terms of tokenization, in 12 months, it quadrupled essentially in terms of investments. It's telling you like alarm bells of what's to happen next. As the Genius Act essentially gains momentum, analysts essentially expect the trend to accelerate, potentially essentially bringing in trillions of dollars in legacy value onto public ledgers for the 2026 economy. This trend indicates that the boundary between traditional finance and the digital asset space is disappearing, replaced by a unified system that prioritizes efficiency, 24/7 availability, and global reach. Massive, absolutely massive news. Now, moving on essentially from exceeding $25 billion to Canton, which is the other crypto project, essentially CC, which essentially I've talked about before when it's essentially it's another project that's being seen inside the financial sector. Why am I sharing this? Because of this. Canton's Yovel, essentially rules, says smart contract blockchains face a reckoning over value gap. So what does it mean by this, and why is this good information to know about? Ruse, the CEO of digital assets and key figures behind the Canton network, has issued a stark warning that the smart contract industry is approaching a reckoning due to a widening gap between technological potential and actual economic value. Ruse argues that while the utility era has promised to revolutionize the global digital economy, many public blockchains have failed to capture the complex requirements of high finance institutions. This perceived failure in the current financial plumbing suggests that many essentially existing protocols may struggle to justify their valuations. They cannot move beyond speculative use cases and into the rigorous demands of the legacy banking system. What is he talking about? Mainly, he's talking about there's a lot of crypto projects out there that over the years have promised so much, but the reality of it is, once we go into regulations, once we go into a Clarity Act and other regulations that are going to be coming down the road, where utility is going to be seen more and more inside the crypto space, those projects that promise for the longest time might not deliver. And the projects that actually have utility will be taking the ranks. XRP Ledger taking the ranks. Now, obviously, he's trying to, talk about his own project or push his own project out there, essentially being the CEO, essentially all the backings of, Canton Network. The point he's making is valid. I would have to say 100%. The value gap identified by Ruse highlights several critical friction points that remain unaddressed by essentially popular decentralized networks. Privacy and control. Institutional players require a level of digital sovereignty and transaction privacy that transparent public ledgers often cannot provide, and create a banking blockade for sensitive corporate essential operations. Hence why Ripple essentially XRP Ledger offers this service to institutions. It was the only one offering this since day one. But institutions not using public ledgers, has been refuted multiple times. Institutions do actually, it's been mentioned multiple times by BNY Mellon, Franklin Templeton, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, that they've had discussions of using essentially public ledgers, and it's not really a big deal for them if there's ways around to, for KYC, for AML, know your customers, essentially anti-money laundering. As long as these things are protected and there's no fines and lawsuits in gray areas, they're perfectly fine to use public ledgers. But now also they have the chance, the option to use crypto mixes to even stay essentially, private. Interoperability essentially hurdles. The lack of seamless communication between disparate blockchain networks prevents the flipping of the switches for large-scale capital movements, leaving many assets stranded in isolated digital silos. Regulatory mismanagements. Ruse notes that for the US Clarity to be truly effective, the underlying technology must be designed to accommodate complex legal and compliance mandates of the old guard financial world. In other words, if there is going to be any blockchain project out there, one or two or three blockchain projects to take the ranks of the financial sector, they have to provide a service that was previously being used by the traditional sector, but just in a digital format. The XRP Ledger is the only one that does that. From start to end. Canton Network can provide those services as well, but not to the scale essentially of what Ripple can do, because they've been making acquisitions, they've been buying billion-dollar corporations. They've not only been buying billion-dollar corporations to push the XRP Ledger into the DTCC or any other financial sector out there, they've also been buying other corporations that's going to be automating certain other aspects essentially of the financial sector that is typically done by paper form essentially, or essentially, in terms of humans. Ripple's also thought about everything else. They haven't just thought about essentially, just payments or privacy to payments. Ripple's thought about everything. automating essentially the task that a traditional financial firms essentially would do. Every aspect of the financial sector, Ripple has thought about since day one. Hence why they were designed essentially, Ripple designed themselves essentially alongside the banks day one, whereas nobody else did that. No other project did that day one. Canton has been in the sidelines for a while, behind the scenes, working with the banks, basically following Ripple's blueprints. But you know what Canton doesn't have? And to be fair, Canton, it seems like a genuinely good project. And I think it actually could have a very good future for itself. But what they don't have on Ripple is Canton is a type of project that, just like everybody else, has to be tested and so on. I'm not saying Ripple doesn't get tested, XRP Ledger doesn't get tested, they do. But there's a difference. So Canton is like the rest of the projects inside the crypto space, like Solana, like Ethereum, like AVAX, or so on. They're all essentially, foundationally based. They're not going out buying billion-dollar corporations and changing the names to Canton Prime, for example, and so on, because they don't have the budget for it. They don't have the money for all the backing for it. They're more like, pick me, test me out, I'm great. Whereas Ripple's more like, let's take another step inside the financial sector and buy that company out because that will give us more leverage, or buy that company out. And they're doing it in an international sense. They're not just buying out essentially, companies that are just some in the Asian spectrum, the British companies that they brought out and so on. So Ripple can take steps that other blockchain projects can't. And they're both being tested essentially as well. But while XRP Ledger is also getting tested by institutions out there that might just pick it to test it out, but Ripple's also taking extra steps by purchasing out billion-dollar corporations to push Ripple payments, the XRP Ledger, XRP's tokenization, and so on. That's why essentially they're different compared to any of the financial projects out there. Whereas Canton doesn't have the budgets to do that. They're more like, pick me, test me out, I'm a great project. And it probably is, and it is in reality. But they're more like pick me rather than buy a billion-dollar organization to push myself out there. As the industry matures towards 2026, the focus is shifting from simple token issuance to sophisticated automation, essentially of entire financial workflows. Analysts suggest that the rules essentially call for reckoning may serve essentially as a catalyst for the Genius Act momentum, pushing developers to prioritize institutional grade infrastructure over retail centric features. While the growth of tokenized assets remains impressive, the next phase of the digital economy will likely be defined by essentially networks that can bridge the divide between decentralized innovation and ironic essential requirements of global sovereign finance. Look, some points he made are extremely valid. When it comes to a lot of crypto projects that have promised a lot of things, they most likely won't be able to deliver it under the Clarity Act when we go to utility. There are projects out there that weren't bluffing. They have the contracts to prove it, the licenses to prove it internationally, and so on. The NDAs or the acquisitions they made in terms of billion-dollar deals, those projects weren't bluffing. XRP Ledger and so on. There are projects out there that have obviously been bluffing for the longest time. That they're faster than the XRP Ledger, or they're cheaper and so on. As if anybody could care less. 1 millisecond faster isn't going to make a difference for anyone. Now, moving on from that to Trump. Before we talk about Trump, let's go to the comment section first. Let's see what's happening there. And then essentially, we'll talk about the next news on Tice Live, which is about Trump. So let's see where we were at. We were here. Why do people know? Okay. Why is some okay, we're here. Some saying Epstein files reason Trump go to war. The people that are saying Epstein's files is the reason for Trump to go to war are morons. Look, everybody's so hooked on the Epstein file situation. Let me just make one thing clear. The only reason, and I'm not saying, Epstein was a horrible man. Just want to put that out there first. I could use other words, but I can't use them. You know why? Because this is live and I can't use certain words. But Epstein was a horrendous person, a human, a horrendous human being. No doubt about it. And anybody that was involved in any sort of those acts is also a horrendous human being, and they should pay for it. But let me just make one thing clear. Everybody that's coming out and saying, Trump this, Trump that, Trump Epstein, that's why he's going into war. He doesn't want people to know about the Epstein files. Obama could have essentially released the Epstein files. Some may argue that Biden's administration couldn't release the files due to the courts not letting them, which I don't buy even for a second, but I'll give those people the benefit of the doubt. they couldn't release on the Biden's administration because the courts were handling. Even though the courts, those same courts, are weaponized to go against Donald Trump, which is the interesting factor here. But here's the thing: they tried everything to take Trump out. They even tried taking Trump out, essentially, so he doesn't become president. Believe me, if there was anything incriminating enough to take Trump down through the Epstein files, and I'm not saying he's not mentioned in the Epstein files. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying Trump has never been mentioned in Epstein files, because he has. But what I am saying is, if they had anything on Trump, believe me, when Trump was trying to become president again, the Biden administration would have released it. Or the Obama administration would have released it. But they didn't. And if you think to yourself, Biden's administration, Obama's administration, didn't release Trump's files and they were just sitting on it, BS. I call BS on that by a mile. Because Biden's administration tried everything to essentially to make sure Trump doesn't become president. They tried to pin him for anything they could possibly list. So believe me, if they had anything on Trump that was incriminating enough to make that man look incredibly evil, you don't think they would have released it by now? So anybody trying to suggest, Epstein and so on, and that's why Trump's going to war, moron. Also, there is so much evil happening in this world. One of them being essentially Epstein himself, but there is still so much evil happening in this world that doesn't get mentioned. And I'm not trying to say nobody be fixing on Epstein's situation, should be, but don't get distracted by the Epstein situation, because unfortunately, those people that did do horrendous things in the Epstein files, they're so high up that unfortunately they won't be seeing prison sentencing. At best, they'll see bail and house arrest. And that's a very unfortunate thing to happen, that we have powerful individuals who take advantage of their positions and do certain bad things to other people. And that is so wrong, and it shouldn't happen anywhere in this world. But there are so much other also evil things happening in this world that doesn't get talked about. And I can't mention essentially what they are, but you can take a guess of whatever else is happening around this world. Don't let this BS of Trump and Epstein, that's why he's going to war, essentially, because believe me, if they had anything, they would have released it. And if Biden's essentially, presidency was such a legitimate, kind-hearted presidency, why didn't they release Biden's laptop? Why didn't they essentially not release Biden's laptop? If Biden's administration is ever going to argue the point of we couldn't release the Epstein files because the Supreme Court was handling it, therefore we couldn't release it. If you wanted to, you could have released them, mate. So I don't buy that even for a second. But sure, Supreme Court was handling it during Biden's essential administration. That's why they couldn't release it. Why didn't they release the Hunter? Why didn't they release Hunter Biden's laptop? That wasn't being handled by the Supreme Court. That could have been released. Why did Hillary Clinton delete 10,000 emails and nothing happened to her? So this argument that the Democratic Party has started and the liberals have started as well. And believe it or not, Iran is also a part of, trying to take Trump down since day one. They were behind Trump's shooting as well. It was revealed that they were behind it, and I wasn't shocked even for a second that the Iranian regime was trying to take out Trump before he becomes president. You could tell why the Iranian regime wanted to take out Trump before he becomes president, because look at what's happening to the Iranian regime right now with Trump. So you could tell why they wanted to take him out. And good that they missed, and that Trump is taking his revenge on the Iranian regime right now. But I don't even buy that for a second, because if the Democratic Party had anything on Trump, they would have released it to make his credibility go to zero so that he never becomes president. If they haven't released it, that means they have jack squat on him. All they have is his names being mentioned here and there. Good evening, Miles and CMF. Mike, good to see you. How you doing, brother? How you been? Looking over here. Good evening, Miles and family. I'm late. Apologies. I'll rewatch after. No problem, Lena. Good to see how you doing. What about Miles and CMF? Good to see you as well, Ray. How you doing? Wow, the Clarity Act benefiting banks. Interesting. It definitely is. Mike, good to see you. How you doing, brother? T, is it spelled Canton Miles? And where to get it? And is it worth buying now? Canton is an interesting play. It could potentially be a good project as well. I think it's an interesting play, definitely. CMC, type on Canton and it'll come up which exchanges are listing it. Or if you want to, just leave a message outside the live show and I'll put a link towards us as well. Good evening, Miles and CMF. Bit late today. We'll catch up later. No problem, Black Soppy. Good to see how you're doing. Thanks for the retweet as well. By the way, if you haven't retweeted CMF members or like this live show, once again, I know who retweets these live shows every night when I do them on the Friday, and I know who doesn't retweet and like as well. Just putting it out there. Now, Trump. Trump's cyber strategy vows to support the security of cryptocurrencies and blockchains. It's the first time we're having cybersecurity conversations, cryptocurrencies, United States, because we've just been having Clarity Act, Genius Act, Clarity Act, Genius Act. But now, cybersecurity, United States, cryptocurrencies, Trump. The administration has unveiled a comprehensive new cyber strategy that explicitly includes the protection and support of cryptocurrencies and blockchain sectors. Once again, Trump is taking another step inside the crypto sector. By categorizing digital asset infrastructure as a vital component of national security, the executive branch is signaling a move to fortify the financial plumbing of the modern economy against foreign interferences and cyber threats. This shift essentially marks a transition into a more proactive utility era, where the government seeks to ensure that the flipping of the switches for digital finance is shielded by the full weight of the federal defense resource. The strategy outlines several essentially key pillars intended to stabilize and secure the digital asset landscape. Infrastructure protection. The plan mandates increased coordination between intelligence agencies and private blockchain developers to protect the networks that underpower the Genius Act initiatives from state sponsored attacks. Resilient payments. By prioritizing the security of stablecoins and decentralized ledgers, the administration aims to bypass the vulnerabilities of the legacy banking blockade, ensuring that the US capital can move securely across the globe. And also, the policy emphasizes that the secure environment of essentially for the United States Clarity Act to succeed, encouraging American firms to lead the world in developing a tamper-proof financial technology. Obviously, as we go into much of a more of a digital world, cybersecurity is extremely important. Protecting our assets is key, not just a Genius Act and a Clarity Act. Yes, Genius Act, Clarity Act, amazing, incredible. It will open up so many doors for the crypto space. But governments also have to think about the cybersecurity side, which is nice to see America being the first one to take a big interest in that sector. Market observers view this strict pivot as a major validation of the long-term role of decentralized assets in 2026 global economy. By moving from a posture of skepticism to one of an active defense, the government is providing the institutional on ramps with the security guarantees necessary for large scale adoption to happen, while geopolitical tensions and conditional surrender theoretics continue to create market noises. This cyber strategy suggests that the underlying foundation of digital assets is now being treated as a permanent and essential fixture of the American financial power. If the United States right now, under the Trump essentially administration, is now thinking about cybersecurity, protecting American crypto assets, great. Honestly, amazing play. Genuinely. Now, I'll give it a couple of days or a week where we start seeing other jurisdictions around the world starting to mention cybersecurity and so on. Whatever America does, everybody else follows. Easiest way to put it. We've seen that more and more happening throughout history, you could pretty much say. Now, Latin America is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. So, while the banking industry may be trying to essentially, keep the crypto space at hostage, not all banks, but some are definitely looking like, they're weaponizing essentially certain sectors. Well, they have been during Biden's administration, not anymore. Latin America has been doing some incredible numbers inside the crypto space. Here's a recent update on that. Latin America's crypto user growth outpaced US by 3 times in 2025. The reports have just came in. A new report reveals that Latin America has become a primary engine for global digital asset adoption, with user growth in the region outperforming the United States by a factor of essentially 3 over the past year. This surge highlights a significant shift in the utility era as millions of individuals across essentially Central America, turn to decentralized protocols to preserve their wealth and facilitate a cross-border trade. By bypassing essentially the facilities in cross-trading, by bypassing the frictions of the legacy banking blockade, the region is effectively rebuilding its financial plumbing to prioritize peer-to-peer efficiencies and inflation resistance. The rapid expansion essentially in the region is driven by several critical economic and structural factors. Remittance innovation, high utility essentially networks are increasingly being used to flip the switch on international transfers, allowing tokens, essentially allowing workers to send funds home instantly at a fraction of the cost in traditional services. In nations facing persistent fiat essential volatility, digital assets have transitioned from speculative investments to essentially to essential tools for everyday capital preservation and commerce. The lack of traditional banking infrastructures in rural areas has created a massive on-ramp for mobile-based digital wallets, accelerating the transition towards a fully digital native economy. As the Genius Act and the US Clarity Act continue to reshape the regulatory landscape in the North, the explosive growth in Latin America suggests that the global South may lead the world in practical, daily usage of the technologies. As your analysts note that the success of this emerging markets provides a powerful proof of concept for the 2026 essentially global economy, demonstrating that decentralized sentiment layers can thrive in environments where traditional systems have failed. While the US focuses on essentially institutional integration, Latin America is proving that the real power of technology lies in its ability to provide a financial sovereignty to the unbanked and underbanked. Big, honestly. And it does make sense why cryptocurrencies will take off in essentially in Latin America, because a lot of their currencies, essentially in Latin American countries, are not doing too well. To be fair, a lot of currencies aren't doing too well around the world, but over there also too. And they're utilizing, essentially, the retail section is utilizing cryptocurrencies a lot, especially to send money back and forth from Latin America to essentially Central America. Now, it's nice to see crypto is helping essentially the retail section a lot in terms of international basis. Coinbase is what we're talking about next on tonight's live. Coinbase says the US tax reporting rules for crypto are wasteful. Coinbase has issued a formal critique of the newest tax reporting requirements for digital assets, labeling the mandates as both wasteful, in other words, entirely a completely waste of space for burgeoning the industry. The exchange argues that the expensive rules, which require detailed reporting for a vast area of digital transactions, imposes a significant, essentially, administrative burden on firms trying to build out the modern financial plumbing of the digital economy. This friction points to highlights and growing tensions in utility era, while the drive essentially for regulatory oversight under the US Clarity Act occasionally clashes with the practical realities of maintaining an efficient digital native ecosystem. The exchange's objection centers on several key concerns regarding the implementation of these new protocols. Overboard definitions. Coinbase contends that the rules fail to distinguish between high quality commercial transactions and similar, essential, and simple peer to peer transfers, potentially creating a banking blockade of paperwork for everyday users. Technological mismanagements. Critics of the policy suggest that the old guard approach to tax collection does not account for the automated nature of small contracts, leading to the redundant data requests that do not accurately reflect the economic gains. An innovation drain. There are concerns that the high cost compliance could stifle the momentum of the Genius Acts by diverting resources away from technological developments and towards complex manual reporting systems. Coinbase is trying to argue that if we're going to go into a digital world, then the taxation system should also adapt and become digital as well. And trying to apply old taxation rules of immense amount of paperwork doesn't really fit in with the agenda of a digital world, which is a fair point. Despite these challenges, the debate over tax reporting is seen by many analysts as a necessary step to the flipping of switches, because it is. We need to have taxation rules to essentially have all institutions and banks and governments on board. Someone needs to, in other words, the easiest way to put it, the house needs a cut. If we're expecting the world to go digital and we want the banks' money inside the crypto space, we want the high profile investors' money inside the crypto space, we want hedge funds inside the crypto space due to their money, we want essentially family offices due to their money inside the crypto space, and so on. The list goes on. If you want all of these people and investors and governments and CEOs and CTFOs and so on money inside the crypto space so we can benefit, then there need to be certain laws, and one of them needs to be taxation. So the house can essentially get a cut, the government, in other words. So that is essentially what the argument is for the house essentially needs a cut. While the Coinbase continues essentially to lobby for more streamlined and common sense applications of the law, the 2026 regulatory environment is increasingly focused on integrating digital assets into the formal national accounting frameworks. For the broader market, the outcome essentially of this dispute will likely determine how smoothly the transition from legacy financial systems to fully transparent and compliant digital economies will be processed in the coming years. Look, we need taxation laws essentially if we want their money. We can't have their money and have it our way all the way. It's just not possible. So if we want their money, then we need to have taxation laws. Otherwise, they won't get involved. Now, putting that to one side, but also to having discussions about taxation, good sign, especially now. US banks consider legal action against the OCC over what you may say. Ripple and Circle getting an approval. You know, if you're not threatened by another company, let's say you are the CEO of a major company, a behemoth inside the financial sector, you are the CEO of that company, and some other company out there who you might not see at your level gets some sort of approval. If you think they're not a threat, then you wouldn't even bother with anything. You just go, oh, let them stay on the sidelines. So what? They got an approval. They still mean nothing. They're going to achieve nothing. I'm still bigger than they are. And who I'm representing right now is essentially the banks. The banks essentially, saw these companies as the little guys, the sideline guys. They're not going to make anything from themselves. Ripple, Paxos, Circle, Coinbase, they're going to become nobodies. The banks are still number one. And that's how the bank mentality works. But when you are threatened by the competition, lawsuits start flying out left, right, and center. So it seems like maybe the banks are thinking about lawsuits. They're angry that essentially Ripple and Circle received approvals from the OCC, a green light to be able to move forward and turn into banks. A group of traditional US banks is reportedly weighing in legal action against the OCC. Now, just to point out, this is not a legal action against Ripple. It's not a legal action against essentially Circle. It's not a legal action against any crypto company. It's a legal action against the OCC that approved these companies. So it's like somebody suing the SEC, but they didn't sue Ripple. Following the agency's recent move to grant specialized federal charters to Ripple and Circle, the banking, which is the old guard, argues that these approvals grant crypto native firms an unfair competitive, essentially, advantage by allowing them to access the federal payment system without stringent capital requirements and oversights faced by legacy institutions. I'll be very honest, the legacy institutions, even though essentially they're arguing the point of we had to go through strict compliance and we're still under strict compliance as a big bank or a big corporation, yet all of these banks and all these corporations still received massive fines for not tiptoeing into gray areas, but deep diving into gray areas. Where, certain banks, the things that they have done over the years is I mean, I can't even mention it because of certain families they worked with essentially in Mexico. One particular bank essentially, worked with many families in the Middle East who are terror families, and other families essentially in the Mexican families as well, in terms of essentially they were also a different type of terror families essentially. So interesting that the banks are arguing the points of, we had to go through stringent, essentially, compliance, and that's why we are above board. That's basically what they're trying to say. The banks are trying to say we are always essentially number one in terms of safety, security, listening to the rules and regulations, while the crypto companies don't listen. They didn't go through the same restrictions essentially we have been under, and so on. But the banks have broken every rule. I mean, if you just search up JP Morgan fines, you will just get headline articles. JP Morgan fined from essentially hiding client essentially in terms of money laundering purposes of clients and so on. JP Morgan fined because of this. JP Morgan fined because they weren't transparent. JP Morgan fined because, and the same goes on for every other bank. HSBC fined. There was a documentary about HSBC Bank on how they accepted, knowing essentially that who they were accepting and how they got away with it. There was a documentary. How they got away with it is they moved the dots. So, for example, let's just say if the person's name was James, for example, and James, let's say, was a bad person, a well known evil person in the world. HSBC knew who he was. What they did was they set up a special department in HSBC Bank for those types of clients to accept them. And how they did it was, let's say if James was a bad person, they would just put J.AMES. It was still James, but they put a dot. So now it's somebody new. And HSBC did this willingly, essentially. They created a whole department for it, which till this day they'll argue, no, we didn't. We never had a special department. We never did this. Yet they paid a fine for it. So the idea that banks, essentially are coming out and saying we are above board, we're always, legitimate, we've never done anything wrong, we're always compliant, we're very different to the crypto space. The crypto space is dirty, it's full of criminals, and they should not be on the same level as banks. Laughable at best for the banks to be, saying that we are saints and the crypto space is criminals, while the banks have been paying $1 million fines. The potential, essentially, lawsuit highlights the intensifying battle over the future of American monetary systems. The essentially, controversy. Traditional lenders contended that the OCC has overstepped its authority by flipping the switch for non depository institutions to perform banking functions, potentially undermining the stability of the national financial framework. XRP Ledger's integration. Ripple's federal validation is seen as a critical step in the US Clarity Act. Momentum, essentially, as it paves the way for the XRP Ledger to essentially to serve as the primary settlement layer for domestic and international interbanking transfers. Stablecoin competition. The inclusion of circles suggests that the government is moving towards a model where tokenized dollars are treated as a legitimate form of a legal tender, a shift that banks fear could drain deposits from traditional accounts into digital economy. Yes, it definitely would. But banks are arguing we can't borrow money, lend money, essentially, give mortgages out and credit cards out if we're not getting, what we want, essentially, in terms of people putting our money with us. But then crypto companies could offer lending, if you stake your assets or borrow against your assets. So crypto companies can do that as well. So Ripple could obviously offer somewhere down the line, essentially, stake your assets, get a loan or something. It's already been happening. We have Nexos and some other platforms out there. Legal analysts suggest that this confrontation could serve as a defining moment for the Genius Sect, as it forces the courts to decide whether digital asset firms can coexist on equal footing of the legacy banking sector. In other words, this is the last thing that the banks have up their sleeve. The banks have tried everything to slow down the crypto space. First, the banks and Swift laughed at the crypto space. Day one, the banks and even Swift laughed at the crypto space. And then companies like Ripple came along essentially and started to show signs of, oh, CRAP, this is happening, is what the bank's probably thoughts was when they saw companies like Ripple taking the ranks slowly. What did they do? They weaponized essentially the SEC on the Biden's administration, weaponized some Democratic politicians. Elizabeth Warren is always there to catch a good paycheck day, and so on. And they tried to slow down the competition so maybe that they could catch up and so on. They tried everything they possibly could to slow down the crypto space. Yet companies like Ripple grew bigger and bigger and bigger until now they've become unstoppable, especially with Trump's administration on their side, not just on Ripple's side, but also on Coinbase's side, or essentially on Circle's side, or any American essentially blockchain company out there, mainly Ripple in this case. But you can genuinely tell that they are threatened to the max. First, we had Swift coming out essentially saying, nobody's going to use Ripple, nobody's going to use the XRP ledger. We are number one. We will always be number one. When a company comes out and says, we are number one, nobody's going to use them, we will stay here forever, that tends to mean that that company sees that as a threat. And let me make instead this bold statement to bring confidence back to my company, Swift, is what Swift was trying to do when they made the statements of nobody's going to use Ripple and nobody's going to use the XRP ledger. What they were trying to say is, let's restore some confidence that Swift is still number one. And in reality, it's losing pace quite rapidly. But there were people inside the crypto space, there was a lot of XRP haters out there that hold XRP, ironically, that lapped it up like a pet. They saw Swift essentially tweet and they went, yeah, look, even Swift said nobody's going to use it. Of course they would say that, because Swift is trying to restore some faith back to Swift, which just shows how threatened they are essentially by Ripple and the XRP ledger. That's what they were trying to do. Same scenario here. That's why I brought that up. Same scenario here. While essentially, why is the banks, trying to sue the OCC? Because that's all they have left. They tried weaponizing the SEC. They tried weaponizing certain Democratic politicians, Pocahontas. They tried essentially, slow down the crypto space, and now they're thinking about suing the OCC. They have nothing left, which is a good sign for us, because it means that they're losing incredibly bad if they're thinking about suing the OCC, and that Ripple is winning like fireworks against them. On that note, we have also reached the endings of tonight's live. This was the CMF live show, stands for Crypto Mouse Family. My name is Miles. You can tune to this live Monday to Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards. For the most recent news, we go on cryptocurrency, CBDCs, AI politics, and regulations. Disclaimer of this live show, as always, is not financial advice, not political advice, and whatever I say is only for entertainment purposes. And this was episode 445 of the CMF live show. If you haven't liked or retweeted essentially this live show, I don't know why. I really don't know why. As I said, I can tell who likes and who retweets this live show. CMF members, just letting you know, when the time comes, I can tell who likes and retweets these live shows. So if you haven't liked or retweeted, like and retweet the live shows and put a comment outside the live. And also, if you're watching us on YouTube, drop a like, put a comment outside the live as well. Before we do go, obviously, let's go inside the comment section. Let's see what's happening there. Just saying, there's going to be a time when you would need my help, and I could tell if you've just been watching the live shows or actually engaging with the live shows by liking and retweeting and putting comments outside the live. If you want my help, it works both ways. Like and retweet. Before we go, let's go inside the comment section. As I said, let's see where we are. We were here. Banks acting. Hi, Mouse family. Is it true? No, okay. Yeah. Hi, Mouse family. Is it true that banks are using over the stablecoin yields, or suing over the stablecoin yields? They're suing because Ripple and Circle shouldn't be getting a license. Banks acting shady to cater to bad men. Well, I could have never imagined that. It's good point. Sarcastic way. The audacity of the dirty banking industry. Facts. Hello, Miles and CMF. Manny, good to see you. How you doing? Good night, Miles and CMF. All thank you for a great live and news. Let's go, JP. See you tomorrow at the same time as usual. Take care, Miles and CMF. Ray, let's go. See you tomorrow at the same time as usual. Thank you for keeping us updated, Miles. Have a lovely night. All. Let's go, Lena. See you tomorrow same time as usual as well. Great live as always, Miles. Have a great night and see you tomorrow same time. Let's go, Autistic. See you tomorrow same time as usual. Good night, Miles and CMF. Let's go, Mike. See you tomorrow at the same time as usual. Thank you so much, Miles. Good night, everyone. Let's go, Stormy. See you tomorrow same time as usual as well. I will see all of you tomorrow, same timing as usual. 10 p.m. long time onwards. Everybody have a great day or a good night, depending on where you are around the world, CMF members. Love you all. See you tomorrow, same time as usual. Like, comment, follow, retweet, subscribe if you already haven't. If you have, thank you so much and welcome to CMF. Love you all. See you tomorrow, same time as usual. Thanks, Miles. Great info as usual. Much appreciated. Let's go, Shelly. Shelly, see you tomorrow, same time as usual as well.